who in the world has ever written a history about how great Korea was? He says, we have never celebrated Admiral Yi Sun-shil.
미국의 명문대인 컬럼비아 대학에서 역사학자로 학생들을 가르치고 있는 리차드 블리의 교수. 그는 전 세계적인 존경을 받는 석학이자 한국에 큰 관심을 갖고 있는 학자로 손꼽힙니다. 그런데 그가 한 한국인 학생의 대답에서 큰 감명을 얻었다며 이순신 장군에 대해 이야기하기 시작하는데요. 정말 인상 깊은 포인트가 많습니다. 영상으로 만나보시죠.
Interesting thing was, when I did it for a second year, and went around asking what the bias was, one student said exactly what his bias was. He was a Korean student, and he said, I am going to be a nationalist historian. I'm going to write histories that will glorify my country, because all the countries of Europe went through a stage of nationalist historiography, where people wrote about how wonderful England was, or how wonderful France, or Germany, or Italy, how great these countries were, how great Islam was, how great China was. Who in the world has ever written a history about how great Korea was? He says, that will be a bias, because I know that another 20 years later, someone will come along and be a revisionist and read my books and say, well, this is just ridiculous exaggeration of the national identity of Korea. I believe he actually did then become a Korean historian. And I really appreciated his comments, because he was right. Countries do often go through a stage of nationalist history. Look at the American myth of the founding fathers and so forth, and how we are savagely taking it apart now. Does every country deserve a moment of nationalist vainglory? How do you get a topic implanted in the historical imagination at the level of world history? Do you have to have some period of rhetorical overkill in order to get there? We have never celebrated Admiral Yi Sun-shil, the greatest military hero in Korean history, whom I was checking the other textbooks in the field a day or so ago. Not a single one mentions him, except ours, and we don't really say much about him. An admiral who fought 23 battles at sea and won them all, including one in which he had 13 ships as opposed to his opponent's 333 ships, of which 140 were battleships and were combating ships, and the others were mostly logistics.
한국인은 누구나 아는 이순신 장군의 전투지만 강의를 듣는 학생들에게는 생소할 수밖에 없겠죠? 리처드 블리의 교수님은 이순신 장군이 세계 역사에 더 알려져야 하는 이유를 이렇게 설명합니다.
The Japanese, when they defeated Russia in a crucial battle in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, the Japanese admiral declared that his Korean precursor was the greatest naval mind in history, and certainly comparable to Horatio Nelson, for example. And yet, no one has ever heard of him. Admiral Yi, he has a nice statue in Korea, but Admiral Yi is nobody in world history, because there has never been a nationalist Korean history to tell the Korean story with the hyperbole and the emphasis upon glory and achievement that so many other countries benefit from. And they benefit from it because they make events or personalities into household terms. You know, like everybody knows who Robespierre is, or Henry VIII, or Martin Luther, or something. I mean, spends a lot of time talking about Hideyoshi. But Hideyoshi is just mentioned as having made these overseas expeditions to Korea between 1587 and 1592. The word war doesn't get used. If you're a Korean historian, a nationalist Korean historian, you talk about the Imjin War. Imjin is actually in the Korean calendar, it refers to a year period. It's not a place. But the Imjin War, from a Korean standpoint, is as big a deal as the 7 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, or First Crusade, any war you want. Scale. 1 million people apparently died. Korea was devastated at a level that historians consider to be beyond the devastation that occurred during the Korean War of the early 1950s. 1 million people are killed at a time when the whole world population is only about 350 million. It's a lot of people. And it was part of an effort by Japan under the command of Hideyoshi to conquer China. You just can't get to China without going through Korea. So he sent over fleets full of soldiers, and all of Korea was conquered. And it didn't succeed was because of Admiral Yi. Admiral Yi became a commander of the Korean fleet, one of the commanders of the Korean fleet, and he destroyed every Japanese fleet he came across. The most phenomenal series of victories. And he made it impossible for Japan to conquer China because they could not resupply by sea. They could not carry their troops into China by sea. And he basically saved Korea because Korea was utterly defeated on land. Every part of Korea was occupied by the Japanese. Brutally, murderously. It was one of these horrible occupations. Seoul, Pyongyang, Busan, all these cities came under Japanese occupation. The Korean military forces on land were totally incapable of fighting the Japanese. And the Korean military forces at sea won every engagement, but only if Admiral Yi was in command. There was another admiral whose name was also, unfortunately, Yi. This is Admiral Yi Il, who lost major engagements. This was just Yi Sun-shil who was the successful admiral.
리처드 교수님의 강의를 듣고 나니 그의 말대로 이순신 장군이 얼마나 훌륭한지 그의 업적을 한국인들이 스스로 알려야겠다는 생각이 드는데요. 오늘 이야기도 흥미로우셨다면 좋아요와 구독 부탁드릴게요. 항상 함께해 주시는 구독자, 시청자 여러분 감사합니다.